listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with The Briefing. As wildfires continue to rage in LA and the death toll rises to 24, with more than 10,000 properties destroyed, we're starting to ask ourselves here in Australia, are we ready if fire threatens a major city here? Australians know bushfires. We've seen the devastation firsthand and on the news, but more often than not, this happens in regional Australia, rather than burning down whole suburbs in a major city. Depending on where you live in Australia, the fire season now runs from June to February, leaving only 3 months of the year where major fires are less likely everywhere. But LA is on fire in the middle of winter. So how do we need to change our understanding of fire while watching this from afar? And how prepared are our fire services to protect us? Craig Lapsley is Victoria's former Fire Services Commissioner and is currently supporting firefighting efforts in LA. Craig, welcome to The Briefing. Watching the LA fires continue to burn, should we be preparing for something similar in Melbourne, Sydney or Brisbane, for example, in the not too distant future?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when I was in a previous role as Commissioner of Fire and Emergency in Victoria, we made a really strong effort to connect to California. And the reason we did that is that the California landscape and the history of fire is very similar to Australia in many ways. So, yes, we do need to keep a close look at what's happening in Los Angeles and learn. But on the same token, I always say we need to be really respectful and humble because there are things that are different in Los Angeles or the Los Angeles basin than there are here. Fire's fire, houses are houses, people are people, but there still are some differences of the way the landscape is, the backdrop of Los Angeles, the history of the place, how they build, how they live there, and the differences of what fire means to be in that landscape.
You've been speaking regularly to fire chiefs on the ground in LA. What are you hearing from them right now?
They have gone through a very traumatic process. Firefighters normally go out to help people and they win. The other day they were beaten without a doubt. There was no doubt, and I had the opportunity to talk to one of the chiefs the other day, and he said, it was a day no matter what we did, it didn't change the outcome. They from the sky, from the ground, from moving people, and I think they're quite shocked. And in the discussion, it was very much about, well, there's more to come as well. So it's not just over. They've got another Santa Ana wind event this week. Starting now, so Sunday in LA now, and it's going to go through until Wednesday. So they've got 3 or 4 days of strong winds yet again. So it was almost like they'd been to the first 2 quarters of a game and they played the best they could. They're in for half time and they've got to go out again for the next 2 quarters. And obviously the next 2 quarters will be really critical because the harm and what's already occurred in there is so significant. You wouldn't want that to extend if possible, but they're up against it because they've got the Santa Anas back, and they're the strongest winds you could possibly have. They're hurricane-type winds, but they don't bring rain with them. Like a hurricane normally is followed up by a lot of wind and water. This is a lot of wind and no water. So they're in a really hard spot, and that's why I think we've got to probably watch and learn, but be very supportive to who they are and what they are and what they're feeling and experiencing as a community, but also as people, just as people. And I suppose the other comment I'll make, it's very quick that we can go and say, look, it's the rich and famous in the Palisades that were impacted. It's broader than that. It's normal people that have lost their homes, impacted their lives, and these impacts are so significant. The consequence of this event is so significant, and it's not as if we haven't been there in Australia. I was put in after the 2009 bushfires in Victoria to reform the place, and we did lots of things different. The same happened in New South Wales with the 2019-2020 summer season, and New South Wales learned a lot from that too. So there's I suppose a respectful, humble part of me that says let's be very supportive. Let's not be too judgmental, but hopefully we will get some things from LA that we can learn about it happening in Australia. And it's fair to say it could happen that suburbia could be burnt in any of these cities. Adelaide with the hills, Melbourne's northern suburbs, fires in and around Sydney through the Blue Mountains and into the suburbs. It can happen. It's not as if this is something that won't happen to us, but hopefully we can learn, and we have already learnt many things that positions ourselves to be in a good position to do okay if that was to occur.
We are used to devastating bushfires, especially in the regions in Australia, but less so in cities. It is quite shocking to see suburbs in a major city burn in America like that. Do you think that people in Australia living in cities might be too complacent about what they need to do to stay safe?
Yeah, look, I think humans, all of us, if we haven't experienced it or haven't had the imagination to think what it is, it's very difficult. So the front page of the Melbourne Herald Sun the other day had a photo of the Palisades and suburbia, and I work in LA quite a bit, and I know that community. I should drop in there on a regular basis. It's a beautiful community. And it was even horrifying to me to see how much of suburbia had been impacted from something that is the bush that was 4, 5 miles away, and how it had moved through not only one or two houses, but total streets, total neighbourhoods and total communities decimated. Now, we saw that in certainly in Victoria in 09, where Marysville as a community every house was burned except for, I think, 12 houses. So we've actually seen it, but this was at another level again, that it was suburbia, and those people would have woken up that morning as a beautiful morning that was 28 degrees, blue skies, and by mid-afternoon, everything's gone. So your question's spot on. I mean, if I lived in the northern suburbs of Melbourne or Adelaide or Sydney, it's not easy to think, I'm in suburbia and I'm going to be taken out by a wildfire or a bushfire. I think that is hard to capture.
How prepared are fire authorities for the next time we see absolutely catastrophic conditions in Australia, do you think?
I think they're well prepared because the lessons before us have been there. The challenge will be, I think, is mass evacuation. I think there's lots to be learnt about the evacuation of mass numbers of people. If you had to see large parts of suburbia move, I think that is something that LA or California or the states do different than us, and they've got a very strong mandatory evacuation approach. If we had to mass evacuation to their levels that they've talked about over there, I think that would challenge any of the emergency police services in Australia. And that's not a criticism, that's a reality by numbers alone. But, when you get back to the world has changed a bit, so people now can work more effectively away from home through the internet. How do we pick that up in emergency management? That, we keep people connected through the social networks and the social media networks and use them more smarter and quicker to give what used to be seen as, physical face-to-face support. How do we do that better in a network approach? Not everyone's connected is the other thing, though, in that sense. So how do you get people connected? And you don't underestimate what pets mean. Animals in people's life are huge, and so it's easy to say move people, but what about their companion pets, animals, and even livestock? Those things are really important.
Mm.
And I think the other one that comes up, which I do not have an answer for, is insurance. I'll ask you the question nicely, and you could ask me the question, do you actually understand your own insurance policy? And I'll guarantee I would say I don't understand every fine line in the insurance policy, and I probably should. So those sorts of things will come up to be pretty quick in my mind that aren't necessarily the response to the emergency, it's the consequence of the emergency in how we function as people and how we support each other. And then all those things around us about insurance and how we may be not allowed back in our community. So being disconnected from our communities, I think, is one of the key things.
One of the key criticisms we've heard out of LA is about access to water, or that the water supply wasn't as it should have been. Is that problem possible here?
Yeah, water is the weapon against fire. That's the key. Whatever happened there about supply of water, low pressure, running out of water, I'm not certainly the expert to know what happened in LA, but it's a fundamental part of the plan that you need to have access to water. Now, if I just stop there and take you to the fires previously in Australia, when, particularly in 2009 in Victoria, it was the 13th year of a drought, so even water was scarce. There wasn't water in dams. There was water reservoirs around the state were low. So all of a sudden there was a lot of planning put in to say, how do we get the best of what's available? And it's not on the day. It's got to be in the design. It's got to be in the architecture and the infrastructure of how these things work, that you've got, gravity feed, backup pumps, water feed, whatever it is that's got to be done, or supplementary water supplies. So all of those are important to be part of a really good bushfire plan.
Outside of drought, is there a scenario in which there could be a bushfire in any of the cities that you mentioned before, where firefighters go to fight the fire and they just don't have the water that they need?
If there is poor supply that you know about, it should be built into the plan. That's the key. So I'd like to think that it's a perfect world and there's 100% commitment that water supplies are guaranteed, but I'm sure there'll be someone that says, no, look, we've got a really poor supply line, and on the hottest day, we're at the end of the line and we get the lowest pressure. But I think, if there is a takeaway early in this thing, the supply, the guaranteed supply of water has got to be one of them, that all of us should be saying, how does it happen for me as an individual, right through to how do the agencies and water authorities provide that? But I suppose all of us should take that responsibility and say, where do we get our water from? And question the point of how secure is it and guaranteed is it on those days that you really need it, the hottest, windiest days where everyone wants to drag water out of the same main.
Many of Australia's firefighters are volunteers rather than on the payroll. Is that the right model? Look,
anywhere in the world, a blended model between paid and volunteers is the right model. And you can always have the argument about, more career firefighters for purpose. I think the main thing is you get the blend right. One thing about volunteers, and I use the term, that you don't have to be professional to be paid. Like the volunteers come, and their commitment to what they do and how they do it, and their professionalism in the approach they take is exceptional. And we in Australia shouldn't lose that. If anything, we should go out of our way to promote volunteerism, and particularly volunteer in times of need in fire and flood and storm. So they are a really important part of the system. But you can't do it without career firefighters as well. Now, is that 50-50? Is it 20-80? It depends on where you are. Suburbia would tend to see more career firefighters. But on the same token, in the outer metropolitan areas of all of our capital cities, there's a huge pool of people that could be and should be volunteers. And they should be given the opportunity to be volunteers, and we should support that. So if you get the blended model right, it's a very powerful model, a seriously powerful model. And what goes under that then is relying on the community as well. For those that do not volunteer or don't get the opportunity to volunteer, that they still have a role to play as well about how they prepare their properties, prepare themselves, and the behaviours and actions that they take.
Over the weekend, the European Copernicus Climate Service confirmed that the world had crossed the feared threshold of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Most of the world signed up at the Paris Agreement to avoid that. You've got lots of personal and professional experience with natural disasters. How do you feel about that personally?
Well, it is concerning, the fact that we've got to those thresholds. And I suppose I've always said we're in a position where we don't need to scare people, but we need to make sure people take these things seriously. Everyone has a responsibility. I've often used the term that if you're not a climate change believer, there's enough evidence, and you've just put it on the table, that there is a change in the climate, and we need to understand that. So if the term climate change is to some people seem to be very much a political thing, let's just back up from that and understand that the world has changed. It's a global issue. And as a result, we're seeing more frequent and more intense extreme weather events. And that leads us straight to the emergency space. And, fire, drought, hail, wind speeds, whatever it is, extreme weather events is quite broad. And when you see them come together and we see longer periods, so the traditional summers aren't the traditional summers, it's a fact.
Craig Lapsley, this has been really important. Thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you.
Victoria's former Fire Services Commissioner Craig Lapsley there. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might be keen to hear it. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow from 6 a.m. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.